We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Mesechet Sanhedrin. This is Sanhedrin Daf 88b. On the previous Amud, there was a Machlokas Amoraim with regards to a Zaken Mamre. The Machlokas Amoraim was between Rav Kahana and Rav Elazar. Rav Kahana says that the Zaken Mamre is only liable in a very specific scenario where the Zaken Mamre says, Kachi be'enai, this appears to me to be the halach, it's the Zaken Mamre's opinion, and the Bezdin says they have a tradition. So in such a situation, we would say that the Zaken Mamre can be liable, otherwise the Zaken Mamre is not liable. And Rav Kahana says it's not true, even in a situation where completely the reverse, even if the Zaken Mamre says he has a particular tradition, and the court says that it seems, in their opinion, not like the Zaken Mamre is saying, even in such a scenario, the Zaken Mamre can be liable. And so the Gemara is in the middle of bringing a proof from Rav Yoshia, bringing various statements from Rav Yoshia, and the second statement of Rav Yoshia is Ben Sora Umora. When it comes to a Ben Sora Mora, Sheratzu Aviv V'imo Limcholo, let's say his father and his mother, they want to forgive him, they want to forgive their son who's a Ben Sora Mora. So Mochlin Lo, so Rabbi Yoshia says they can forgive him. And Rashi explains, Ben Sora Mora, Af La'achar Shehisru Bo, even after they warn him, V'kilkel, and then he commits the Aveira, V'hilku, and they give him Malchus, V'chazr V'kilkel, and he does it again, he commits the Aveira. Imratzu Limchol, if they want to forgive, V'lo Haviyu Lebezin, and they don't bring him to Bezin, Mochlin Lo, then they can forgive him. Sha'akos of Tala Bohem V'tafsu Bo, because the Pasuk says it's all dependent on them, they have to seize him. And finally, the last statement of Rav Yoshia is Zaken Mamre. If you have a Zaken Mamre Sharatzu Bezdino Limcholo, that is Bezdin wants to forgive him, Mochlin Lo, they can forgive him. And now Rabbi Yoshia continues and he says, Ukeshabasi Eitzel Chaverai Shabedarim, when I came by my colleagues in the south, Al Shnayim Hoduli, on the first two statements I made, they admitted to me that I am correct. But Al Zaken Mamre Lo Hoduli, but when it came to Zaken Mamre, they did not admit to me, they did not agree that a Bezdin is able to forgive, Kedei Shelo Yirbu Machlokas B'Yisrael, because we don't want to let the Zaken Mamre off the hook. We don't want to increase arguments in Klal Yisrael. And the Gemara says, Tiyufta, indeed, this is a refutation. And Rashi explains, Tiyufta midatoli taima b'shelo yirbu machlokas, from the fact that it says the reason is that there shouldn't be machlokas. It means we're very strict on a Zaken Mamre. So Shema Mina, so you see from this, Afilu hu omer mipi hashmui, even if he says it's a tradition, v'hein omerim kachu beineinu, and they say this is just our opinion, even in that situation, he can be liable, and that's in accordance with what Rebbe Elazar said. And the Gemara continues, Tanya, we learned in a Braisa, Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Mitchila lo hayu marbin machlokas b'Yisrael. Originally, there was not a lot of machlokas in Klal Yisrael. Ela bezin shel shivim v'yechad, rather the court of 71, Yoshvin belishkas hagazis, they sat in the lishkas hagazis in the Beis HaMikdash, Ushnei botei dinin shel esrim ushlosh, and then there were two other courts of 23 judges each, Echad Yoshev al Pesach Harabayis, one was sitting at the entrance to the Harabayis, v'echad Yoshev al Pesach Azara, and one was sitting at the entrance of the Azara. Ushar botei dinin shel esrim ushlosh, and the other courts of 23, Yoshvin b'chol hayoros Yisrael, they sat in all of the cities of Israel. Hutzrach hadavar lishol, if something needed to be asked, shoalin mi bezdin shebe'iron, they would ask from the court of their city. Im shamu, and if the court heard the answer, if they knew the answer, amru lahen, they would say it to them. Vim la'avin, if not, boin lazesha samach le'iron, then they would come to this one that was close to their city. Im shamu, if they heard amru lahem, they said it to them. Vim la'avin, if not, boin lazesh al pesach harabayis, then they came to the court that was at the entrance of Harabayis. Im shamu, if they heard amru lahem, they would say the halacha to them. Vim la'avin, if not, boin lazesh al pesach hazar, they would come to the court that was at the entrance of the courtyard. V'yomer, and he would say, Kach darashti, this is what I have darshaned, V'kach darshu chaverai, and this is what my colleagues, this is what they say, this is what I say, and this is what they say. Kach limadati v'kach lamdu chaverai, this is what I have taught, this is what my colleagues have taught. Im shamu amru lahem, if they heard the answer, they would say to them. Im lavin, if not, elu ve'elu boin lishkas hagazis, then they would all come to the lishkas hagazis, to the Sanhedrin. Shasham yoshvin mitamin shel shachar atamin shel bein harabayim, there the court would sit from the time of the bringing of the carbon tamin in the morning until the time that they brought the carbon tamin in the evening. Uveshabbosas uviyamim tovim yoshvin b'chel, and on Shabbos and Yontiv they would sit not by the lishkas hag, but they would sit by the chel, another area of the Beis HaMikdash. Nishala she'ela b'fneihem, and the question was asked before them. Im shamu, if they heard the answer, amru lahem, they would say to them, im lav, and if not, omdin et leminyan, then they would stand and be counted, they would vote. Rabu hamitamim, if the majority said tamei, timu, then they would say it's tamei. Rabu hamitarin, and if the majority said tar, then taru, then they would say that it was tar, it was pure. Misharabu talmidei Shammai v'Hillel, when the students of Shammai and Hillel increased, shelo shimshu called sarchan, they hadn't served all what was necessary to know the halacha properly. So Rabu machlokas b'Yisrael, so then there started to increase arguments among Klal Yisrael. V'nasis Torah kishtei Torahs, and the Torah became like two Torahs. Mishamin, from there, kosvin v'sholchin b'chol makomos, they would write and they would send to all areas. Kol mishu chacham v'shafel ushval berech v'das abrios nocha heimenu, anybody who's wise, anybody who's humble, and anybody who's pleasant to other people, yehei dayan be'iro, that person should be a judge in his city. And misham ma'alin oso lahar habayis, and from there, if the person was qualified, they would bring him up to har habayis, and misham la'azara, and from there they would bring him to the court of the Azara, and misham, and from there lalishkas hagazis, he would finally be promoted to the Sanhedrin that was in the lishkas hagazis. Shalchu mitam, they sent a message from over there, from Eretz Yisrael, Ezeu ben ha'olam haba, who is a person who merits olam haba, and vason ushval berech shayef ayel shayef v'nafik v'gores bo'raisa tedira, someone who is modest and someone who is humble, someone who bows when he enters and he bows when he exits, and he learns Torah all the time. V'lo machzik tivus l'nafshi, and he doesn't give credit to himself. And the Gemara says, Yavu be Rabbanan eineho, and the Rabbanan, they set their eyes, they looked, Ravula Barabba, who had these characteristics, he had these qualities. And Rashi explains, Yoshvin bechel, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, the Sanhedrin would sit in the chel, which is translated as the ramparts. Why did they sit in a different location? Mimnei shoam rav, because there were a lot of people at that time. Umokam tsar lahem belishka, there wasn't enough room in the lishkas hagazis. Inami or shelo yehu nirim ki yoshvin bedin, we didn't want it to appear as if they're sitting in judgment. Shebelishkas hagazis hayudanim, because it was in the lishkas hagazis that they would sit in judgment. V'zeh ikar, Rashi says the second explanation is the proper explanation. And misham ma'alin oso, and then it said that the judge would be promoted to the higher courts, lios dayan b'harabayis, meaning he would be a judge in harabayis, k'shemei sechad mehem, let's say one of the judges there died, v'yoshev shamat shemei sechad mishal azara, he would stay there, sit there, until one of them died in the azara, u'ma'alin es sham, and then they would bring him over there, v'kulan yesh bohem ma'alo zeh mizeh, each one again, you would be promoted up to the higher court, again, as there were spaces opening in those courts, and shayef means again, shocha nichnas v'shocha yotze, he would bow when he enters, and bow when he exits. And again, the Rabbanan set their eyes upon Ravula bar Abba. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Chazar le'iro v'shana, it said in the Mishnah, that he goes back to his city and he continues to teach what he taught before by the Zakin Mamre. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Eino chayiv ad sheyasa kahora also, he's not liable until he acts in accordance with his own ruling, o sheyora la'acheirim v'yasu kahora also, or he instructs others and they act in according to his ruling. And the Gemara says, Bishlama yora la'acheirim v'yasu kahora also, I understand if he instructs others and they act in accordance with his ruling, so meikara lav bar katalu, originally he didn't do anything to be liable to the death penalty, v'hashta, but now that he's issuing this ruling and people are following, bar katalu, so now he's somebody who's liable to the death penalty. Ela sheyasa kahora also, but if he does in accordance with his ruling, so meikara nami bar katalu, so originally also he was liable to be killed. And Rashi explains, meikara, again, if he's instructing others and they act in accordance to his ruling, so then originally, kodem shabal lebezin, before he came to bezin, shabalishkas hagazis, that was in the lishkas hagazis lishol, to ask, meaning before he became a zakin mamre, lo havim mechayev ketali, he's not yet liable to the death penalty, kol kama, to lo avedi ugufe, if he himself didn't commit the actual avera, and so he only becomes liable to the death penalty again when they act in accordance with his ruling. But in a situation where he himself does in accordance with his ruling, so meikara nami bar katalu, so originally also he's liable to the death penalty. Im osa avera sheyesh ba misas bezdin, have a mikdal, if he's going to act in accordance with his ruling and do an avera where there's a death penalty, so he's getting the death penalty anyway. What is the fact that he's a zakin mamre, what does that add if he's already liable to the death penalty? And the Gemara continues, it makes sense in a situation where he issues a ruling with regards to chaylev, which is non-kosher fat, or dam, or blood. So there, let's say he commits the sin, that's not something that carries the death penalty, it only carries kares. But now that he's a zaken mamre, so that's going to carry the death penalty, so that would make sense. But in a situation where he's issuing a ruling by chayve misas bezdin, and we're saying that only when he acts in accordance with his ruling, then we say he's liable to the death penalty. So meikaranami bar ketalu. So originally also he's going to get the death penalty, meaning even without being a zaken mamre, if he's committing this aveira, he's going to get the death penalty. And the Gemara continues and explains, originally boy hasra, if he's going to commit this act, in order to get the death penalty, he needs a warning. But now when he's a zaken mamre, lo boy hasra, no warning is needed. If he acts in accordance with his ruling, he's going to be considered a zaken mamre and get the death penalty, even if he wasn't given that warning at the time that he committed that act. But the Gemara continues, mesis, but what about if we're talking specifically about a mesis, one who incites others to commit avodah zarah, the low boy hasra, where a warning is not needed? So then, Ma'ikal, what are you going to say over there? Because in that situation, again, just committing the aveira itself is liable to the death penalty. So what does Zak and Mamre add in that situation? And the Gemara says to that, no, Meikar originally, Omar Taima, if he would give some kind of reason, Mekabelin and Mine, we actually would accept that from him, and we won't give the death penalty. But Hashda, but now that he's a zaken mamre, Yomar time, if he says a reason lo mekablin and minei, we will not accept that from him, and he's still going to be liable to the death penalty. And Rashi explains, mesis de lo boy hasra, when it comes to a mesis where a warning is not needed, im hoya mesis umore tam heter, if he was a mesis, if he incited people to worship avodah zarah, and he gave some reason, some rationalization why it's mutter, velomar ein beloshan hazeh hasas, he says in the language that I'm using, this language is not inciting, meikara nami miktel below hasra. Originally also he's going to be killed without a warning when it comes to a mesis, but the Gemara says it's not necessarily true. Iyamar taimel is chus, if he gives some kind of reason for innocence, la'atzule, to save himself, so then he will be saved. Aval hashta, but now that he's a zaken mamre, yomar time, if he gives some kind of reason, lo mekablin, and we're not going to accept it, sharei shama mi pi bezin shelo lasos v'himra, because in this situation he heard from bezin not to do that, and he rebelled, and so that's what's being added by the fact that he's a zaken mamre. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Chomer b'divrei sofrim mi b'divrei Torah. There are stringencies with regards to divrei sofrim, rabbinic interpretations of the Torah, from divrei Torah, from the Torah itself, in the following fashion. Ha'omer ein tefillin, kedei lavar al divrei Torah. Let's say a person were to say there is no such thing as halach of tefillin, and it's to transgress the words of the Torah. He's going against the words of the Torah. In terms of zaken mamre, he'd actually be potter. Actually, in that situation, he would be exempt. He would not be liable. But it's more stringent when it comes to interpretation. Chamish totafos, let's say he says there are 5 totafos in the tefillin. Lahosav al divrei sofrim, that's adding on to the interpretations, to the rabbinic interpretations, which says that there are 4 totafos, so then chayiv, in that situation, he would be liable. That's a stringency by divrei sofrim. And Rashi explains, ha'omer ein tefillin potter, if a person says there's no tefillin, he's exempt, de'ein zu hora, because that's not even considered a ruling. Dezil kari be'ravu, you could just go read from the psukim, everybody understands that there's tefillin. And Rashi continues, Chamish totafos yesh, if he says that there are 5 compartments in the tefillin, 5 totafos, sha'afal pi she'ein davar zeh ela lahosav al divrei sofrim, even though over here all he's doing is adding on to the rabbinic interpretation, chayiv, he is liable. The medrash to sofrim, who, because this is a medrash of a rabbinic interpretation, letotafos, 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 from the words letotafos, harei kandal, we say that the total is 4, letotafos without vavs, those count as 1, letotafos with the vav, that counts as another 2, that's a total of 4 compartments and not 5, so again in that situation he would be liable. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amar Rabbi Oshia. Rabbi Lazar says that Rabbi Oshia says, Eino chayev el al davar sheikaro midivrei Torah perusho midivrei sofrim. When it comes to zaken mamre, he's only chayev on something where the source is from the Torah, and then the interpretation is a rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. V'yesh bo lahosef, and there's something that can be added on. V'im hosef goreya, and if one does add on, then he actually makes it worse. V'ein lanu el tefillin al liva de Rabbi Yehuda. And the only example we actually have of this that qualifies as this is tefillin, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Rashi explains, V'yesh bo lahosef, meaning it's something where in theory you can add on al masha pirshu chachamim, on that which the chachamim explained. V'im hosef goreya, but if a person does add on, he makes it worse. Meaning uposel harishon bitosafto, by adding on, he actually disqualifies everything. Ve'ein lanu ela tefillin, and the only example we have is tefillin, which means as follows. She'ikaron b'Torah, first of all, the main idea of tefillin is found in the Torah. Uperushon midivrei sofrim, and then the interpretation, that's rabbinic, meaning shem dalid bottom, the interpretation of the fact that there are 4 compartments, that comes from the Rabbanan. V'yesh lahosef chamisho yoser, and it's possible to add. A person can do 5 compartments or more. V'im hosef goreya, and if he does add on, he actually makes it worse. To ka'avar b'bal tosef, because now he transgresses bal tosef v'lo avad mitzvah, and he hasn't even fulfilled a mitzvah. And Rashi continues, Ve'ali b'de Rabbi Yehuda, and this is specifically according to Rabbi Yehuda, meaning to say, Amar Rabbi Oshia lamilse, Rabbi Oshia is following Rabbi Yehuda's opinion when he says this, Di Amar la'ela di'ika Torah v'yorucha, because it's Rabbi Yehuda who's the one that says that it needs to be something that has Torah and yorucha, meaning again, ikaro min ha-Torah, that the main thing comes from the Torah, upeirusho midivrei sofrim, in the interpretation, that comes from the Rabbanan. But the Gemara continues, Va'ika lulav, but what about lulav? That should be another example. Why only tefillin? The ikaro midivrei Torah, because the main idea of tefillin is in the Torah, upeirusho midivrei sofrim, and its interpretation is from the Rabbanan. V'yesh bo lahosef, and it's possible to add on. V'im hosef goreya, and when a person does add on, so he actually makes it worse. But the Gemara says, no, but lulav, when it comes to lulav, my svirulon, well, what exactly do we hold in terms of putting together all of the different species of the lulav? Isvirulon, the lulav ain't sarach eged. If we think that a lulav does not really need to be bound, everything doesn't need to be bound together, so then hailechu dekoi, v'hailechu dekoi, so then everything is actually independent. V'isvirulon, the sarach eged, and if we hold that binding it is required, so garua v'omedu, it's not actually something that is worse through the adding on, it's already worse from the outset. And Rashi explains, Hai lechudei koi, this is by itself, meaning ve'ein ze goreya, that would not be considered goreya. If a person were to have an additional min, since he's not binding all of them together, that would not be a situation of through the host suffix goreya. And if we hold that binding is required, so then garua v'omed, so then it's garua from the outset, meaning demitchilaso lo asa kahogan, meaning from the very beginning he didn't do what was proper. Sha'agad sham tosefes mitzvah, because he bound there an additional mitzvah. Va'anon ba'inon goreya dahashta, we need that he made it worse right now, meaning shahaya mitchilaso kosher, it has to be a situation where originally it was kosher, uposlo bitosefto, and then by adding something on, that caused the disqualification. That's true by tefillin, but it's not true by lulav. And we will take a look at Tosas over here. Tosas asks, it's a wonder, Amaylo mishkach lulav l'Reb Yehuda b'chiyai gavna. Why can't we find a situation by lulav, according to Reb Yehuda, in the following situation? Sha'agad gimul minin b'fnei atzman. Let's say he bound together 3 species by themselves. The nasa b'kasher, so now everything was done in the kosher way. V'yachar kach agad imoy and minacher, and then he goes ahead afterwards and he adds another species. The havale mosef goreya. That would be an example of adding on and then making it worse. And Tosas explained, v'yei shlomo, we can say as follows: Kevan dekodem netilaso nifsal havelei garua v'omed. Since before he actually took the lulav, at that point in time it was already possible, so therefore that's called garua v'omed. Avol tefillin, but when it comes to tefillin, you can have a scenario as follows: Im hinichon barosho bekashros. Let's say he put it on his head and it was kosher at that time. Then v'hiniach gabayu bayis chamishi. Then he adds a 5th compartment. Hareze mosif goreya. So that would be an example of adding on, which makes it worse. Sheposlan, he now makes it disqualified. Umevatel mitzvah shal rosho, he nullifies the mitzvah that's on his head. V'lo dami lelulav, and it would not be similar to lulav. Dim notlo va'odo biyado hosa min chamishi. Let's say he took the lulav, and while it was in his hand, he added a 5th species. So ein zem mevatel mitzvah, so that actually would not nullify his mitzvah. Because the moment he took it, he was already yotzei. But the Gemara continues, Vayika tzitzis, isn't there another example of tzitzis? The ikaro midivrei Torah, its sources from the Torah. Upeirusho, and its interpretation, midivrei sofrim, is from the Rabbanan. V'yesh bo lahosef, and this is also something which can be added to. Vim hosef gorei, and if you add, so then you make it worse. And the Gemara says to that, but tzitzis my sviralon. Well, when it comes to tzitzis, what exactly do we hold? Isviralon de kesher elyon lav doraisa. If we hold that upper knot is not doraisa, so hay lechudei koi v'hay lechudei koi. So then each one is independent. V'isviralon, and if we hold, and Rashi explains upeirusha midivrei sofrim, the interpretation of tzitzis is midivrei sofrim, which means dalit chutin, that there are 4 strings. The alfinan gedil beis gedilim dalit. We learned that out from the pasuk. Kesher elyon. Now, if we hold that the upper knot is not doraisa, meaning sha'os and samach leknaf, that's the knot that we make near the corner. Kishenislu hachutin, when we hang the strings. Ve'al yedein and nasin chibur latalis, it's through that it's attached, that the strings are attached to the talis. If we hold that's lav doraisa, if we hold that's not doraisa, and the gears is changed by the Mesoras Hashas to Kilomar, meaning to say halacha l'Moshe misinai. It's a halacha l'Moshe misinai. De plugsa hiva menachos, that this is a machlokas in menachos. So if we're going to hold that, so hay lechudei koi, so then each is independent. De kaven de lo nikshar, since it's not tied, eino chiburim hashar, so it's not really attached with the others. V'haroi lemitzvah hi ha-mitzvah v'odev kamisheino. Whatever is fit to be part of the mitzvah is the mitzvah. Whatever is extra is not going to count. Meaning to say, if you're not really obligated to tie it all together, so then whatever extra is just simply not going to count, and it's not going to be a situation where we're going to say the person added on and it's going to be disqualified. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Tes Amud Aleph.